Hello and welcome to The Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink program. I'm your host, Chiara Rimella. Coming up, we meet the chef behind the Filipino upstart in London.
And kind of honour a lot of the street food roots that we started from and make plates that were just honest and generous and still capture the essence of what Filipino cuisine is.
Also on the program, we swap tasting for listening and discover the music of mushrooms.
There's something about realizing that your food is alive. It's just putting this focus on what we're eating and realizing as we're chewing that this is life.
Plus, our in-house wine expert crowns her wine of the month. All that here on The Menu on Monocle Radio. Many food businesses start as food cart experiments, but when the time comes to find a proper bricks and mortar space, they have to contend with how much of their street food roots they want to keep. For Rex De Guzman, that question felt particularly relevant as his approach to Filipino cooking looks to celebrate the cuisine's inherently casual and quick essence. After all, his restaurant's name, Turo Turo, means point point in Tagalog. It's the phrase used to describe food stalls in his home country. In his recently opened restaurant in southwest London, he has sought to keep things accessible and exciting, including bringing the Philippines' signature boodle fights banquets to the lineup. I sat down with Rex in the studio to find out about this new iteration of his project and what really constitutes a proper boodle fight.
The original pronunciation is Turo Turo. It's essentially a generic term used in the Philippines, which literally translates to point point. So it's about any sort of fast foods or diners or street food stalls. Most of the food isn't labelled, so you'd usually have to point at the pots on display or on the food on display. And I just thought it was really catchy and it just stuck with us because I started the business originally as a street food stall. So it made absolute sense to call it Turo Turo, and we've stuck with it ever since.
See, I think this is interesting because obviously street food is eternally popular.
Yeah.
But a lot of people who then make a move into opening a restaurant or a bricks and mortar space out of it frequently will sort of pivot into trying to go for a sort of fine dining-y version of what they were doing before, or a lot of the time they will try to elevate it in kind of inverted commas. But I feel like you're pretty staunchly determined to keep a sort of casual, kind of streety element to what you're doing. Why is that? And why do you think so many people get tempted into this kind of fine dinification of the experience?
Love that. Yeah, that's a really good point because when I started doing Filipino food, I was all about that as well, trying, as a young chef, wanting to prove myself and just try sort of things that I've learnt, like modern British, French, European techniques on Filipino food. That was pretty much the way I sort of approached the food initially. So doing pop-up restaurants very early on, I was trying to make platey dishes and make things look nice. And there's still a lot of elements of that in the food that I do in the restaurant now. But you're right, like I did want to keep it quite accessible as a concept and kind of honour a lot of the street food roots that we started from and make plates that were just honest and generous and still capture the essence of what Filipino cuisine is without having to... for me, there is always still a level of elevation in doing it as a restaurant. Like you want to present the food in a more attractive way for customers to want to try it. But yeah, I sort of... Personally, through my experience of doing fine dining Filipino food, I just personally never really ate like that myself. So I was doing that kind of food to impress, which is great, and it did work. But naturally and just through experience, I just realized less is more. And just like starting from street food again on my own and building up to a restaurant, a lot of the flavors and the food that I wanted to do, just wanted to capture it as honest as I can without trying to dress it up too much and do too many things on the plate.
I think Filipino food has travelled widely across the world, but more so in certain regions than others. In the US, you can find a lot of Filipino food pretty readily available in street food, etc. But here in the UK, I feel like, at least in London, yes, there are a few restaurants, but certainly not as many as other cuisines. So there's an element of people perhaps not being even necessarily familiar with what the original even is, the original humble is. And so doing a kind of a fine dinification of it may take some people by surprise because they don't have any reference points. Is there an element of what you're doing that also feels like just presenting the thing as it is and sort of seeing people come through the doors and being like, this is the first time I've ever had Filipino food?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point because I thought about, just Filipino food as a market And like Filipino food is already really unknown and still has a huge lacks awareness in the market. So it's still very, very new. So to go even down the fine dining route as a whole and as a concept, you know, you're talking about a very, very niche market, which is not always a bad thing, but you can imagine it's harder to reach more people whilst doing that. So I think balancing presenting Filipino food, but still trying to keep it in balance with traditional Filipino cuisine and what it really means to enjoy Filipino cuisine. What does Filipino cuisine even mean? What does it represent? I think it's really important, and it's important that we don't lose sight of that. And that's why with Turo Turo especially, the kind of concept that I wanted to position it as is ultimately an Asian restaurant. And I'll say that because Filipino cuisine has so many influences, South American or American cuisine, over the years, the Spanish Empire over 300 years, and even the Chinese. But as a Southeast Asian country, it made sense for me to position it more as an Asian cuisine. So even when it comes to the curation of dishes, and when I say this, it doesn't mean I'm just excluding everything else, but I feel like you have to start somewhere. So the curation of the food on the menu, even that, you should be able to read the menu in our restaurant and understand, that there's pancit, which is noodles, there's ginataan, which is a type of, I hate saying curry, but it's very similar to a coconut curry. And that already, those two kind of categories already position your mind as what kind of restaurant I'm going to experience. And I think that level of detail is important and is probably really overlooked because I felt like we had to define ourselves in the market. And so it kind of stems from all these little things sort of add up into what Turo Turo is.
What does Filipino food mean to you? It's inevitable. It's not very original, but inevitable to ask you, what are your memories of eating it growing up? And where do you draw all these reference points in your head?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm a British-born Filipino. My parents never taught me Tagalog when I was a kid. And so I always found myself sort of alienated from other Filipinos who, you know, hang out together and speak Tagalog, and it was really difficult for me to truly connect on the same level. I felt like Filipino food was my only way for me to really connect to my cuisine and culture and learn about it. So it ultimately stems from there. My mum is the main cook in the house, so she's Ilocana, and her cuisine and the way she cooks, the dishes she creates, like, you know, they have very special places in my heart, as with you know, all people's mothers, right? Their cooking is special. So a lot of, you know, I get a lot of questions like, who's your main inspiration for Filipino food? And frankly, when I started out, I didn't have any references because I didn't know any chefs at the time, especially in the UK, who were doing Filipino cuisine. So the only references I had was my mom's cooking and, you know, looking online, doing some research, and then eventually actually going to the Philippines. So I really had to do my own research and just find my own way when it came to putting Filipino food out there.
What do you think is at the essence of Filipino food? You know, we talked about the influences from various different geographical regions, but when you think about, okay, this is the real kernel of what it is to eat a Filipino meal.
Yeah. The essence of Filipino food is ultimately, for me, sharing. It's family oriented, right? So, you know, you can imagine a big dinner table with a pot of rice, a few main course dishes on the table with the ladles from the pots, and, you know, it's just a little bit of this and that, sauces. So it's very generous. It's generous by nature. It's also very resourceful. If I'm really honest, like, a lot of Filipino food isn't that pretty. But those dishes are made from leftovers and waste, and people would usually throw away these kinds of things like offal and stuff, right? And these street food dishes are all made from necessity. So in the Philippines, this is people's way of life. So being resourceful is one of the big attributes for Filipino food for me. But I think in a nutshell, we're talking about sharing, generosity, and family. That's really what it's centered around. And a lot of the food that we do at Turo Turo, you know, it's most of it is groups that come to dine. So the plates, so even if we have small plates, it's all about sharing and for, especially for people who've never tried Filipino food, to try lots of different things together.
I'm very intrigued by this thing that you do at a restaurant, which is where you put all the banana leaves on the table and just sort of pile it with this incredible looking feast. Can you tell us what it is and where does it come from and what could I expect if I did sign up for a feast?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is a boodle fight. which is essentially, one big table.
Why the name, by the way?
I don't know the actual origin of the name Boodle, but the story goes is that it stems from the American and Philippine military, where they didn't have cutlery and utensils out when they were, out wherever they were. And so they would have to get banana leaves and just put it on a table and everyone would use their hands. So it's also known more locally as kamayan, which is to use your hands to eat with. And it's all about camaraderie, where officers and all the soldiers would sit down together, and it's just a place for everyone to just enjoy their meal, kind of like a big canteen, but all on top of banana leaves and using your hands. So all of the food is laid on top of rice. Rice is everything, is the base, and then you can literally put whatever you want. So we're talking fruits, vegetables. You'd have big whole pieces of fried fish. You'd have barbecue skewers, any kind of shellfish and seafood. So it can be as crazy as you like, which is the beauty of it, really, because unless you have a lot of allergies, then
that would be a bad moment to reveal that.
Yeah, that's where we'd have to adapt a little bit. But generally speaking, it's a great way to just enjoy food all together. And I think a boodle fight actually is the essence of Filipino cuisine, because it's all mixed up.
That was Rex De Guzman speaking to me at Midori House. You sure have tasted plenty of it, but have you ever listened to your food? At Michelin-starred restaurant Burdock Co in Vancouver, the team is bringing another sense into the dining equation. Plugging a synthesizer into fruit and vegetables, the team transforms the produce's bioelectric charge into notes and melodies that create your dinner soundtrack for an extraordinary taste-sound menu. Lucy Hyslop stepped into the busy kitchen to talk with chef Andrea Carlson and musician Tarun Nayar, aka Modern Biology, on how so-called plant music is letting its punters tune into another dining dimension.
So when I go to a gig, I have an assortment of electronic odds and ends that usually include a modular synthesizer, a bunch of different guitar pedals and effects. Really, the centerpiece is a biodata sonification unit. It's kind of where all the signals come in. And so I plug electrodes into this unit. And then from there, I'm spreading signal out to a bunch of other modules via a bunch of other cables. So it kind of looks like a spaghetti, or I think it looks mycelial, personally. And so there's control voltage and gate signals being sent from the biodata unit to a bunch of other things, and then I'm taking all of those signals and routing them through a bunch of guitar pedals into other synthesizers, sampling little bits and pieces, looping little bits and pieces. But the kind of most important part is the original impetus. If you're familiar with the idea of cybernetics and, the Brian Eno / Terry Riley approach to music composition from the 70s, it's basically setting up a cybernetic system that kind of has a lot of life and movement, but the impulse is not random. The impulse is, control voltage and gate from plants or mushrooms.
With myriad buttons lighting up, Taryn's setup is hard to miss in the window of the snug Burdock Co space. We're hugged by reclaimed church door panelling all around, and a ceiling created of pine beetle damaged wood, as his synthesizer riffs on the ingredients from tonight's menu motif: citrus-scented rain under a snow moon. All testament to Andrea's natural style of cooking, an homage to the region's tangle of islands and coastlines, valleys and gardens.
Definitely we are in a sense of place here with the Pacific Northwest focus. That resonates most strongly in our food. Lots of long-term relationships with some of the growers that I've known for 30 years. When I started out in this industry, and also lots of new people who've come onto the scene through the years. The most appealing part for me of the dinner is that it is taking people to a new experience around food. I feel that when people come into Burdock & Co. and they have the tasting menu, it's following a narrative. We've just come out of the roots menu, and now we're moving into the citrus menu. The citrus is all from Jane Squire, and her place is called The Garden on Salt Spring Island. The first time anyone has cultivated citrus here in Canada, to my knowledge, on a fairly commercial scale. We're focused on the moon, which right now is the snow moon, but spring is starting to come a little bit, so that was where the name of citrus-scented rain under a snow moon. We just want to evoke those properties of the main core ingredient of the menu and relate it back to the moon. The spring greens have not yet started. The foraged goods are still, lurking off in the horizon. And these are the things that when you have your connection to the food and you can actually see it growing, you can have, a spiritual experience when you see moonlight on a radicchio. Honestly, that's where some of these motifs come from and where the naming of these things comes from. Just like when the spring is coming, there's a little bit of warmth in the air. It's definitely raining in Vancouver. It's raining on the Gulf Islands, and that warming rain is, part of what is allowing the fragrance of nature to start to fill our nasal cavities again.
With some trial taste sound experiments under their belt, Andrea and Taryn know their immersive dinners will stir some highs and lows through the headphones sitting at the guests' tables.
So in the same way that I feel our menus take people on a journey and they experience potentially some ingredients and some concepts that they might not have come across before, modern biology is taking you on yet another dimension of this experience, actually plugging into the fruits and the vegetables. It's such a trip. It is so cool. We plugged into a Buddha's hand citron, and it's this massive, it was probably about 3 pounds in size. It was a huge fruit from Jane, many-fingered, bright yellow. And the music and sound that was emitted from that fruit through his sense was incredible. And it was so delightful. It honestly was a delightful experience for everybody. We're doing this immersive dinner to further express our sense of place. It's one thing to have, for example, on our current menu, the caramelized sunchokes with a little sunchoke cake, porcini sauce around there. I'm like, okay, I'm eating sunchokes and this is tasty. But to actually plug into the sunchoke while you're eating the sunchoke is so cool. And I think that's something that is an expression of Burdock Co. that Taryn's practice and playing allows us to connect even deeper to is that product. And the product is the sunchoke. And that sunchoke was grown in the earth. And we are tapping into that fundamental life force energy of this organic tuber. And that is, for me, it's such a meaningful thing to do. We want to try and help people to connect to where their food is coming from. You don't want to be preachy about it. You don't want to overdo it. And, everyone's busy. And I feel like a lot of people have heard it all before. And there's only so much bandwidth for taking in more information. That ability to help people to connect to their food can get tricky in a standard dining context. But this connection with modern biology and hearing that bioelectric life energy of the food, that is intense. That is really impactful.
A gamut of reactions to these bioelectrical transmissions Taryn also finds intriguing.
There's the obvious surprise at the sense of taste being related to the sense of sound, because I think intuitively that's not something that we think about. And so realizing that through experience is quite profound. I've noticed that even more powerful than that is just the connection that people feel to their food. There's something about realizing that your food is alive. There's just putting this focus on what we're eating and realizing as we're chewing that this is life. And even though philosophically it's like, okay, cool, when you actually realize that what you're eating is alive, I've noticed that one of two things can happen. One, a lot of people feel profoundly guilty. Like, oh my God, I'm taking something else. It's like we're so distanced from our food and where it comes from and the process of most of us of harvesting our food that just realizing that this being has been alive or is even currently alive as you're eating it is almost like more than people are able to deal with. And I think that's part of the reason that we've cut ourselves off from our food, is because it's just kind of easier and more convenient not to think about the fact that this chicken or burdock root was or is still alive. But secondly, some people feel just like a profound sense of gratitude and appreciation. And I think that's probably the more healthy way of eating. We don't want to eat feeling guilty. But it taps into what, obviously, Indigenous folks all over the world have known forever. And it's this idea of we are dependent on life. It makes sense to feel appreciation for what we're eating. And I think as you physically realize that your food is alive, and in this case, we're doing it through listening to bioelectric bubbling, in the form of sound, that connection to our food and where it comes from and the whole ecosystem that we're a part of just happens.
Just as Taryn's modern biology itself harks back to old-fashioned synths without computers and dovetails his university research in biology and biological oceanography.
I just think it's an interesting thing to do, to quote unquote listen to your food as you eat it, because I think there's something there for us to learn. It feels like there's something interesting there to explore. I think that trying to stimulate that curiosity and a sense of wonder is a great starting point to have a deeper connection with nature, just getting into a little kid frame of mind. So that's why I like the attitude of exploration and not, telling people what they should be feeling or thinking, but more just like, let's get curious.
Which is why he happily brings to Burdock the science of Charles Spence, Oxford University professor and author of Gastrophysics, The New Science of Eating, and his work on how frequencies can influence flavours.
1, 2, 3.
Tarun gave everyone 2 pieces of fruit, and he told us about the project from Charles Spence and his research, which demonstrates that if you taste something, and in our case it was a piece of apple, if you taste that piece of apple while listening to a high frequency, the apple will taste sweeter. And if you taste that same apple while listening to a lower frequency, it will taste more bitter. So we did that with a group as an experiment, and Taryn felt it was really important to show people that this was not just kind of woo-woo and that there is actual scientific basis to this. It's not a gimmick, and it's fascinating.
For Monocle, in Vancouver, I'm Lucy Hyslop.
Thanks, Lucy. This is the menu. And finally, it's the last Friday of the month, so we are delighted to welcome our in-house wine expert and Monocle sub editor Chloé Lake for her pick of Wine of the Month. This week, we're in the US for a bottle of Christam's Eola Amity Hills Chardonnay. Chloé, welcome back to the studio. Always a joy to have you here. And a very exciting prospect for today. I can see the bottle in front of me, and it's looking like the kind of thing that I like to drink. Please reveal what is hiding in this bottle.
We are going to the good old USA today. So as an American, surprisingly, we haven't been to the US yet. And it's a world of wine over there. There's a lot to uncork, so to speak. So we'll be heading to Oregon specifically. It's a really great wine growing region. A lot of people tend to focus on Napa Valley in California, but actually Oregon's kind of the unsung hero of the US wine area, I think. So we'll be going there to sample a Chardonnay, which is very exciting.
Well, I have 2 follow-up questions from that. First of all, growing up in the States, when, of course, you were of drinking age, but what kind of memories do you have of wine drinking habits in the country? Do you think that Americans are used to and appreciative of the wine that is made in the country, or do they tend to drink imported wine? How much have the fortunes of American wine also changed on home soil?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, actually. I mean, I'm from Florida, so there's not great wine production there. Where I'm from is known as the pineapple capital of the world, so won't be making
great
wine
title
from
to
that.
have.
Yeah, exactly. I think if you come from sort of Pacific Northwest, maybe where that's a bigger thing, it's more ingrained into your sort of day-to-day life. But other than that, it's not very well perhaps represented state on state. So I think now it's really having a time to grow and to shine, and especially come out of maybe the shadow that it was in during the 90s of big oaky Chardonnays, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different style of wine. But I think that clouded the perception of U.S. wine for a very long time. So it's kind of emerging from that now.
Well, let's dive into the reputation of Chardonnay then, because actually just earlier this week, I was speaking on The Globalist, and we were discussing the sort of renewed fortunes of Chardonnay, particularly here in the UK, which people attribute to a sort of a cameo appearance in the Bridget Jones movies.
Okay.
You know, she's obviously very passionate about Chardonnay.
She is.
And so, you know, one supermarket chain here in the UK is saying that they've seen sales rise a lot. Now, whether that correlates with a newfound appreciation for the quality of the wine, I don't know. But from your experience, what is the trajectory that this grape has been on? Where does it stand? And I suppose, is its reputation set to change?
Yeah, I think a little bit like Bridget Jones, Chardonnay has been on an emotional roller coaster. So
nice.
In the 90s, it was really on the rise. As I say, it was kind of becoming popular in the US. It was, I think, the most planted grape variety at that time. And people were really trying to emulate the success that Australia was having. So a lot of that fruitier, kind of rounder style of white. I think Chardonnay was perhaps a victim of its own genetics in this way, because I often call Chardonnay kind of the chameleon of the wine world. It can basically grow anywhere and adapt to those conditions. So if you have it in a warmer place, it's going to taste fruitier. If you have it in a cooler climate, maybe in Burgundy, you'll get that nice acidity that a lot of people associate with it. So yeah, it kind of fell on its own sword, so to speak, because it had these qualities in the US that people were loving, but many people also disliked. I think those fortunes are now changing, and people are experimenting with different styles and in different regions across the US. Not just in the US, but also in Europe. They're adding maybe a bit more oak and things. And during that time in the 90s, I think because it was becoming a lot more mass-produced, to get that sensation of the oak, people were adding in perhaps cheaper things like chips into the wine, which gave it not as nice of a round flavor. So yes, it's coming back to its roots now, I think, a little bit, which is important.
What about Chardonnay specifically from Oregon? You know, you've mentioned how different climates can have different effects. What is the terroir like in Oregon?
It's very varied. I think Oregon has always been a place of real change, going back to even the Ice Age. It's quite a cool place, but also a place where there's a lot of volcanic soil. So perhaps it's a little bit drier than elsewhere, which means the grapes really have to fight to survive in that environment, and they retain a lot of that amazing flavor. So yeah, it's a little bit less arid, perhaps, a little bit cooler. You've got sea breezes coming in, which really helps the plants too. So it's slightly maybe more of what you'd expect from Margaret River in Australia, a bit cooler tasting Chardonnay.
Well, shall we put the wine itself that we have in front of us to the test?
Absolutely.
So you can sort of tell us about the winery itself as we
for sure.
take a little swig. Beautiful. Okay, so let's dive our noses in.
Let's.
Wow, that's very powerful.
It is really powerful. I think the U.S. is a little bit warmer than Europe, I guess. So you're going to get more on the nose, I think. And despite everything I said about this having higher acidity and being a little bit more zesty, maybe in terms of lemon and citrus, you will still get a little bit of that creamy oak, I think. It is aged in oak, so expect a little bit more butter and cream.
Yeah, but I still think that it has a sort of an uplifting quality to it.
Absolutely.
There is a sort of a citrusiness
yeah. And that
to
will
it.
be from the kind of cool winds that we've mentioned and things, balancing it out.
Shall we?
Yes.
Do you know what?
What
I'm
do you
not
think?
usually one to order Chardonnay because I have been wary of it in the past.
Yes, it has a reputation.
It really does. But actually, as I said at the beginning, the bottle sort of gave me a sense of trust. And I really enjoy this, actually.
Yeah, I think this is, again, more of that traditional style that maybe you'd see from Burgundy. It's kind of the U.S. is transitioning to maybe more of a European approach in some ways to making this style of wine. So yeah, very refreshing, great for spring, that kind of real light lime, that zest you're getting from it, definitely.
What can you tell us about the winery itself? Has it got a hallowed history? Is it a new upstart? Or
So speaking of the 90s, this winery was founded in, I think, 1992 by the Gary family, and they still own the estate today. So they're very passionate about producing kind of biodynamic wines and leading from the terroir, I think, so kind of focusing on the soils and all of that. So yeah, it's a family-run winery still to this day.
So you mentioned it's a unique wine, and you sort of threw a little bit of the springiness of it in there.
Absolutely.
How are you imagining yourself drinking this? If you were to pair it with something, or what kind of occasion and little food pairing would you recommend?
That is a great question. I think because we're in spring, I'm picturing myself on a terrace, glass of wine in hand. Maybe you don't want anything to eat with this, but maybe you do. I'd say maybe classic olives, some chips. Why not? I think small bites, maybe some oysters to kind of set off that kind of fatty, lime, zesty feeling that we have and cut through the acidity. Fish as well, maybe a lemon sole with some butter. That would be great. Capers, anything kind of salty. Yeah, this feels like something I would love to eat with a bit of seafood, a few little snacks, and a nice cool breeze.
Nothing too special then, just oysters and lemon salt.
Yeah.
Okay, no biggie.
Yeah, you got to enjoy it.
Wonderful, Chloe. Thank you so much for your pick.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember that we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's at midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show Food Neighborhoods for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. I am Chiara Rimella. This program was produced by Monica Lillis and our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. Thanks for listening, and until next week.